In December of 2000, a quiet neighborhood in Wichita, Kansas, became the setting for one of the most terrifying home invasions in modern American history. What started as a search for easy money ended with 5 victims, a frozen soccer field, and a survivor whose story would become the key to bringing 2 killers to justice. The events of that night would leave an entire city asking the same question: how could something so horrific happen completely at random? Tonight, we're covering the Wichita Massacre, a story of unimaginable violence, extraordinary survival, and the relentless pursuit of justice. Welcome back to Meals to Unalive For, the podcast where true crime, dark history, conspiracy, and food collide. I'm your host, Jody Breton, and every week we serve up the stories that are as disturbing as they are fascinating, paired with a meal inspired by the chaos. So grab a plate, lock your doors, and let's dig in. For this episode, I'll be making black garlic and thyme beef tartare with bread, wine short ribs, parsnip puree, and a dark chocolate tart. Before we get into the events of that night, I think it's worth asking the question that always seems to come up in cases like this: who are the people responsible? Reginald Dexter Carr Jr. was born on November 14th, 1977, and his younger brother, Jonathan Daniel Carr, was born on March 30th, 1980. The two grew up in Dodge City, Kansas, several hours west of Wichita. According to testimony presented years later during the appeals process, the Carr brothers were raised in a deeply unstable home. Their parents' relationship was reportedly violent and chaotic, eventually ending in divorce. Defense investigators would later claim the family environment was filled with neglect, domestic abuse, and dysfunction. There were also allegations that their older sister had been abused by family members and by some of their mother's later partners. As with many high-profile criminal cases, it's impossible to know exactly what happened behind closed doors, and much of this information comes from mitigation evidence presented by defense attorneys rather than facts established during the original trial. But what does seem clear is that the Carr brothers did not grow up in a healthy or stable environment. By their teenage years, both brothers were already involved in crime. Burglaries, theft, and drug activity had become increasingly common, and they developed reputations for violence and intimidation. Family members and psychological evaluations later suggested that Jonathan looked up to his older brother and was heavily influenced by him. Though the extent of that influence remains a matter of debate. It's a pattern investigators, psychologists have seen many times before. Trauma, neglect, and violence can shape a person's worldview, but they do not determine a person's identity. Millions of people survive horrific childhoods without ever hurting another human being. Understanding where someone comes from is not the same as excusing what they did. And whatever pain or instability the Carr brothers may have experienced growing up, it cannot begin to explain the calculated cruelty that would unleash on the city of Wichita in December of 2000. By late 2000, the brothers had moved to Wichita. They were in their early 20s, unemployed, and already well acquainted with the criminal justice system. What they were looking for that December night was money. What they found instead would become one of the most infamous murder cases in Kansas history. That horrific quadruple murder on December 15th, 2000 didn't happen in isolation. It was the horrifying conclusion to a week-long spree of violence that had already left several innocent people fighting for their lives. Just 1 week earlier, on the night of December 7th, 23-year-old Andrew Schruber stopped at a come-and-go convenience store in East Wichita. Andrew was an ordinary young man, a recent college graduate who had recently moved to Wichita and was beginning the next chapter of his life. Friends and family described him as thoughtful, hardworking, and the kind of person who always tried to see the good in people. That night, Reginald and Jonathan Carr forced their way into his car at gunpoint and ordered him to drive to several ATMs across the city, withdrawing money as they demanded. Throughout the ordeal, Andrew later recalled thinking, "I was just hoping if I did what they said, they'd let me live." After robbing him, the brothers drove Andrew to a remote field northwest of Wichita. There, they pistol whipped him, threw him from the vehicle, and shot out his tires. Then they sped away. Against incredible odds, Andrew survived and was able to provide investigators with valuable information about his attackers. Only 4 days later, the Carr brothers would strike again. 55-year-old Linda Walenta was sitting in her SUV in the driveway of her East Wichita home when one of the brothers approached, pretending to need help. Linda wasn't just another victim, she was a gifted musician and respected member of the Wichita Symphony Orchestra, where she played the cello. Friends remembered her as gentle, intelligent, and deeply dedicated to both her family and her music. Sensing something was wrong, Linda lowered her window only slightly. She believed she had been followed home. One of the brothers shoved a handgun through the opening and fired several times as she tried to drive away. Linda survived the attack and, despite being paralyzed from the waist down, was able to assist police with their investigation. Tragically, she died from her injuries on January 2, 2001. By the time Reginald and Jonathan Carr finally stood trial, prosecutors alleged they had committed one of the most brutal crime sprees in Kansas history. Over the course of a single week in December 2000, the brothers robbed, carjacked, kidnapped, sexually assaulted, and murdered innocent people across Wichita. In total, they faced 58 criminal charges, each including capital murder, rape, aggravated robbery, kidnapping, and animal cruelty. The state would seek the death penalty. The crimes reached their horrifying climax during the night of December 14th, 2000. That Thursday evening, 25-year-old Holly G. went to spend the night with her boyfriend, Jason Beeford, at the townhouse he shared with two close friends in East Wichita. Holly was an elementary school teacher who had spent part of the evening grading papers, a simple, ordinary task that countless teachers bring home every day. Friends described her as caring and compassionate, someone who genuinely loved working with children. When she arrived around 8:30 p.m., Jason wasn't home yet. He was finishing basketball practice at Augusta High School, where he worked as a science teacher and a coach. Those who knew Jason remembered him as patient, intelligent, and deeply committed to his students. Coaching wasn't just a job to him, it was something he truly enjoyed. Inside the townhouse were Jason's roommates. 27-year-old Brad Heike worked as a financial analyst and was known among his friends for his easygoing personality and love of the outdoors. Hunting, fishing, and spending time with the people he cared about were some of his favorite things. Also, there was 29-year-old Aaron Sandler. Aaron had recently made the life-changing decision to study for priesthood, a path that reflected his strong faith and desire to help others. Friends described him as thoughtful, kind, and deeply spiritual. A short time later, Aaron's former girlfriend, 25-year-old Heather Muller, arrived at the home. Heather was a graduate student at Wichita State University and worked as a preschool teacher at a local church. Those close to her remembered her as warm, gentle, and devoted to the children she taught. Holly also brought alongside her miniature schnauzer, Nikki, a beloved companion who was rarely far from her side. Around 9 p.m., Holly went downstairs to Jason's bedroom to grade school papers and watch television while she waited for him to get home. Jason returned from basketball practice shortly after 9:15. By 10 o'clock that night, Holly decided to go to bed. Before joining her, Jason made one final walk through the house, turning off the lights and making sure every door was locked. Aaron had fallen asleep on the living room couch. Heather was resting in the downstairs guest bedroom. Brad was asleep in his basement room. It was just an ordinary winter evening among friends, teachers, students, professionals, and people with bright futures ahead of them. None of them knew that within minutes, Reginald and Jonathan Carr would force their way inside, setting into motion one of the most horrifying crimes Wichita has ever witnessed. Shortly after 11 p.m., the quiet inside the townhouse was shattered. Jason Beeford was still awake when he noticed the porch light suddenly come on. Within moments, Holly heard voices outside, followed by shouting. The bedroom door burst open and a tall, armed man stood in the doorway. Before anyone could react, another gunman forced Aaron into the room. The intruders demanded to know who else was inside the home. Terrified, the group told them about Brad Heike downstairs and Heather Muller, who was sleeping in another bedroom. One by one, they were brought together and held at gunpoint. The friends pleaded with the attackers to take whatever they wanted. "We told them to take our money, take anything," Holly would later testify. "We didn't have much." But the men weren't simply there to rob them. Over the next several hours, the five friends were subjected to unimaginable terror. They were stripped of their belongings, their dignity, and any sense of safety. They were forced into a closet, taken out individually or in pairs, enduring repeated physical and sexual assaults while the others waited helplessly, unable to intervene without risking everyone's lives. Throughout the ordeal, the victims tried to comfort one another as best as they could. At one point, they quietly whispered to each other inside the closet, only to be threatened into silence by the captors. The attackers eventually discovered that several of the victims had ATM cards. One by one, they forced them to leave the house and withdraw money from the cash machines around Wichita. Those who returned never spoke about what had happened during the drive, but everyone understood that survival depended on staying calm and doing exactly what they were told. Aaron, who had recently decided to study for priesthood, even quietly asked Brad whether they should fight back, believing they might not survive the night. Brad, perhaps hoping that cooperation would save them, remained silent. For hours, the group clung to the hope that if they complied, they might be allowed to live. Tragically, that hope would prove unfounded. As the night dragged on, the captors continued forcing the victims to withdraw money from ATMs across Wichita. One by one, they were taken from the house under the constant threat that any resistance would cost everyone their lives. Eventually, Holly volunteered to go next. Before leaving, one of the men allowed her to put a sweater on against the December cold, but she was otherwise left vulnerable as she was ordered to drive. During the trip, she desperately searched for some sign that they might survive. According to her later testimony, she asked, "Are you going to hurt us?" He answered no. Then she asked the question that everyone in that house was silently wondering: "Do you promise you're not going to kill us?" Again, he answered, "Yes." For a brief moment, Holly allowed herself to believe him. On the drive back, he even attempted to make casual conversation, telling her that under different circumstances, they probably would have gotten along. The contrast between those words and the violence unfolding that night was almost impossible to comprehend. Back at the townhouse, the nightmare continued as the attackers searched every room for valuables, tearing through the victims' belongings. Then they found a small coffee can. Inside was an engagement ring. Jason Beeford looked at Holly and quietly told her, "That's for you. I was going to ask you to marry me." In the middle of one of the darkest nights imaginable, Holly learned that the man she had loved had planned to propose just 1 week later on December 22nd. It's one of the most heartbreaking details of the entire case, a glimpse of the future that they thought they had together, interrupted by unimaginable violence. As the hours wore on, the captors made a chilling remark that shattered any remaining hope the group may have held. One of them looked at Holly and said, "Relax, I'm not going to kill you. Yet." For the five friends trapped inside that townhouse, it became painfully clear that surviving the night was no longer something they could count on. After hours of terror, the attackers finally forced the five victims outside into the bitter Kansas winter. The temperature had dropped below 20 degrees and fresh snow covered the ground. The women were allowed to throw on sweatshirts against the cold, but they remained barefoot. The three men were marched outside with virtually nothing to protect them from the freezing night. The captors attempted to force everyone into the trunk of Aaron's Honda Accord, but quickly realized that there wasn't enough room. Instead, Aaron, Brad, and Jason were crammed into the trunk while Holly and Heather were separated into another vehicle. As they pulled away from the townhouse, Holly glanced at the dashboard clock. It was 2:07 in the morning. More than 3 hours had passed since armed intruders had shattered what should have been an ordinary Thursday night among friends. The vehicles drove only a short distance before stopping in a deserted soccer field on the outskirts of Wichita. Surrounded by darkness and snow, the victims were ordered out. Holly was told to stand beside Jason. Heather was placed next to Aaron. Looking at the scene unfolding around her, Holly turned to Heather and quietly said, "They're going to shoot us." The five friends were ordered to kneel in the snow and face away. Then the silence was broken by a single gunshot. In later testimony, Holly recalled hearing Aaron's voice cut through the darkness. "Please, no, sir. Please." A second shot rang out. What happened in that field would forever change the city of Wichita. In a matter of moments, 4 lives would be taken, and one young woman would somehow survive what seemed impossible. Against every conceivable odd, Holly would regain consciousness after being shot in the head. Alone, barefoot, and surrounded by snow, she would walk for help, becoming the only survivor of the Wichita Massacre, and the witness whose testimony could help ensure that Reginald and Jonathan Carr could never hurt anyone again. The first 3 shots echoed through the darkness. Then Holly felt a searing impact to the back of her head. Later, she would describe seeing something turn gray, filled with flashes like stars. Somehow, she remained conscious. She didn't scream or move. Instead, she made a decision that almost certainly saved her life. She played dead. A moment later, she felt someone kick her, knocking her forward into the snow. She stayed perfectly still, terrified that any movement would bring another bullet. Eventually, the attackers climbed into Jason's pickup truck and sped away from the field. As they left, the truck rolled over the bodies laying in the snow. Holly would later recall feeling the vehicle pass over her as well. Only after the sound of the engine had completely disappeared did she dare to move. She slowly lifted her head and looked around. Her friends were laying motionless. Jason was beside her. Believing there was still a chance to save him, she rolled him over and desperately tried to stop the bleeding, using the sweater she had been wearing only moments before. Even after everything she had endured, her first instinct was to help someone else. Then in the distance, she saw a faint glow. Christmas lights. Barefoot, suffering from a gunshot wound to the head and dressed only in a sweatshirt, Holly began to walk. She crossed more than a mile of frozen ground, moving through snow-covered fields, a construction site, around a pond, and through thick brush, guided only by those distinct lights. Finally, she reached a house. She pounded on the door and rang the doorbell over and over until a young married couple woke and answered. "Help me, we've all been shot. 3 of my friends are dead." She still believed that Jason might be alive. The couple wrapped her in blankets and reached for the phone to call 911, but Holly stopped them. She believed she was dying. Before help arrived, she wanted someone to know exactly what happened. Piece by piece, she described the men who had attacked them and the horrors of that night. Only after she was certain they understood did she allow them to call for help. Even then, her thoughts weren't focused on herself. She asked the couple to call her mother and tell her that she loved them. She asked them to contact Jason's parents. And in a moment that speaks volumes about the kind of person she was, the elementary school teacher worried about her students. She kept asking, "Who's going to take care of the kids at school?" When police and paramedics arrived, Holly was able to provide a description of Jason's stolen pickup truck. Investigators quickly traced the license plate through registration records and issued a statewide alert. As the sun began to rise over Wichita on December 15th, 2000, radio and television stations across Kansas broadcast the description of the vehicle. The hunt for Reginald and Jonathan Carr had begun. As Holly fought for her life and helped police piece together what had happened, she had no idea that the nightmare wasn't quite over. After leaving the soccer field, the Carr brothers returned to the townhouse one final time. They loaded Jason Beeford's pickup truck with anything they believed had value: televisions, electronics, and personal belongings that had represented years of hard work and memories for the 5 friends whose lives they had shattered. Before leaving, they committed one final act of cruelty. Holly's beloved miniature schnauzer Nikki was found dead inside the home. The little dog who had simply accompanied her owner for what should have been an ordinary evening had become another innocent victim. But by sunrise, the investigation was moving with remarkable speed. At approximately 7:30 that morning, police received a report that the truck had been spotted outside an apartment building in downtown Wichita. Witnesses reported seeing a man carrying a television set from the vehicle into one of the apartments. Officers quickly surrounded the building. When they knocked on the apartment door, a young woman named Stephanie Donnelly answered. She was Reginald Carr's girlfriend, and he had been staying there. As officers entered, Reginald attempted to escape through the window but was quickly apprehended. During the investigation, police learned that Jonathan Carr was driving a late model Plymouth Fury. Just around noon, officers located the vehicle parked outside another residence in Wichita. Jonathan was there with a woman he had recently begun dating. When he spotted the approaching officers, he ran. It didn't matter. After a brief chase, the police caught him and took him into custody. Less than 12 hours after the murders, both Reginald and Jonathan Carr had been arrested. The brutality of the crimes would shock the nation, and the legal battle that followed would stretch on for years. But because one young teacher survived the impossible and found the strength to tell her story, the men responsible would never have the opportunity to disappear into the darkness. Holly's courage in those few first hours after the attack became the foundation of the entire case against them. As investigators continued piecing together the events of that terrible week, one discovery connected nearly every crime the brothers committed. A maintenance worker found a black 30-aught caliber Lorson semi-automatic handgun discarded along Highway 96 near the soccer field where the murders had taken place. Testing by the Kansas State Crime Laboratory confirmed that it was the same weapon used throughout the crime spree. It had been used to shoot Andrew Schruber's car, to murder Linda Walenta, and to kill Jason, Brad, Aaron, and Heather. With the physical evidence, Holly's testimony, and the rapid arrest, prosecutors believe they had an overwhelming case. The trial itself, however, would not begin without a fight. Defense attorneys attempted to have the proceedings move out of Sedgwick County, arguing that the publicity surrounding the murders had made it impossible to find an impartial jury. Polling showed that the large majority of local residents already believed the brothers were guilty. Judge Paul Clark disagreed. He ruled that the trial would remain in Wichita, where the crimes had occurred, marking the first major legal victory for prosecutors. The defense also sought separate trials. Each legal team planned to argue that the other brother had been the primary architect of the violence, effectively placing the blame on one another. Prosecutors countered that the crimes had been committed together and that forcing dozens of witnesses, including the lone survivor, to relive their trauma twice would be an unnecessary burden. Again, the court sided with the prosecution. Jonathan Carr's attorney made one final attempt to delay the proceedings by arguing that he was mentally unfit to stand trial. After reviewing evaluations from mental health experts, Judge Clark ruled that he was competent, clearing the way for the case to move forward. As jurors learned more about the brothers, they also heard about Reginald Carr's criminal history. Prior convictions for theft, assault, and drug offenses painted a picture of a man who had spent years moving through the criminal justice system. Perhaps the most haunting revelation to emerge from the investigation involved a bureaucratic mistake. Reginald Carr had been released from custody on December 5, 2000, days before the attacks began. Officials later determined that the errors in processing had contributed to an early release. It's impossible to know exactly how history might have unfolded had those mistakes never happened, but many people connected to the case have reflected on the same painful possibility that Andrew, Linda, Jason, Brad, Aaron, and Heather, and Holly herself might never have crossed paths with the Carr brothers at all. In the end, though, the story of the Wichita Massacre is remembered not because of the men who committed it, but because of the extraordinary courage shown by the people they targeted, especially one young teacher who survived the impossible and ensured that the voices of her friends would be heard. In August of 2002, after weeks of testimony and just over a day of deliberation, a Sedgwick County jury found both Reginald and Jonathan Carr guilty of dozens of charges, including capital murder, rape, aggravated kidnapping, and robbery. The jury recommended the death penalty, and both brothers were sentenced to death. But like most capital cases in the United States, the legal battle was far from over. Holly, the woman who had survived the shooting that left her 4 friends dead, told the court, "The sentence imposed on them will be much kinder sentence than they imposed on me my friends, and family. When the jury delivered its verdict Thursday, Mark Beeford, a brother of one of the victims, sarcastically wished Reginald Carr a happy birthday, followed by an expletive, as he was being led away. Carr's response was laced with profanity. Carr's left hand was heavily bandaged. Authorities said he broke it Thursday morning while defending himself when a fellow prisoner attacked him in a holding area. Over the next 2 decades, the case wound its way through the courts. In 2014, the Kansas Supreme Court overturned the brothers' death sentences, ruling that errors had occurred during the sentences phase of the trial. However, the convictions themselves remained intact. 2 years later, in 2016, the United States Supreme Court revised that decision in the landmark case Kansas versus Carr, reinstating both death sentences. The court ultimately ruled that the jury instructions used during sentencing were constitutionally sound. The appeals didn't stop there. The brothers have continued to challenge their sentences through post conviction motions and additional hearings, but the courts have repeatedly upheld both their convictions and their death sentences. Today, more than 25 years after the Wichita Massacre, Reginald and Jonathan Carr remain on death row at the El Dorado Correctional Facility in Kansas. Ironically, although Kansas reinstated the death penalty in 1994, the state has not carried out an execution since 1965. As a result, the Carr brothers have spent decades awaiting an execution date that has yet to be set. For many, the legal process has become almost secondary to the lasting impact of the crimes themselves. Andrew Schruber survived an attack that easily could have ended his life. Linda Walenta fought for weeks after being shot before unfortunately succumbing to her injuries. Jason never got the chance to propose to the woman he loved. Brad, Aaron, and Heather all had futures that were stolen from them in the matter of hours. And then there was Holly. Against impossible odds, she survived a gunshot wound to the head, walked more than a mile through the freezing Kansas night, and found the strength to tell investigators exactly what happened. Her courage became the foundation of a case that ensured the men responsible would never walk free again. The Wichita Massacre remains one of the darkest chapters in Kansas history, not only because of the brutality of the crimes, but because of the ordinary lives forever changed by 1 week of unimaginable violence. And perhaps that's how this story should be remembered, not for the names of the men who committed it, but for the resilience, courage, and humanity of the people they tried to destroy. I hope you guys enjoyed this episode. I certainly did. For this week's meal, I definitely got out of my comfort zone. The beef tartare was surprisingly good. I don't think it's something that I would eat a lot of at one time, but I could see why it's a popular appetizer. I'd never had parsnips before either, and it does bring out the beef flavor, but it's very earthy and potatoes are definitely better, but it was still nice to try something new. And of course, like, who doesn't like a dark chocolate tart? Anyway, guys, I hope you guys liked this episode, and I will see you on the next one. Bye.